Before Steve McQueen was the king of cool, he was just a broken kid. His father walked out before he could even speak. His mother drifted in and out of his life, and the only thing waiting for him at home was violence. By the time he was 9, McQueen was stealing, fighting, and running wild in the streets. Everyone expected him to end up in prison, or worse. But out of that chaos came something no one saw coming. That same pain, that same rebellion, would forge the toughness that made him one of Hollywood's most untouchable stars. This is the untold story of how a boy with nothing became the legend known as Steve McQueen. And it all begins with a childhood that looked nothing like a Hollywood dream. Steve McQueen's life didn't begin with the glamour of Hollywood. It began with abandonment. He was born in 1930 in Beech Grove, Indiana, to a stunt pilot father and a young mother who struggled to provide stability. But before Steve was even a year old, his father walked out of his life completely. That absence became the shadow that followed him for the rest of his childhood. His mother, Julia, tried to make a life for herself, but she was overwhelmed and often unable to cope. She struggled with alcoholism and turbulent relationships. Instead of raising Steve herself, she passed him between relatives, leaving him feeling like a burden nobody wanted. By the time he was old enough to understand, he already knew what it meant to feel unwanted. As a boy, Steve drifted between homes, never staying long enough to feel secure. That instability shaped him. He grew up tough, mistrusting, and fiercely independent. With no father to guide him and no stable home to protect him, the streets became his school. By the age of 9, McQueen was already running with local gangs, stealing what he needed and fighting anyone who crossed him. Teachers saw him as a lost cause, neighbors saw him as trouble, and McQueen himself seemed destined for a life behind bars. But it wasn't just poverty and neglect shaping him, it was the violence inside his own home. When his mother remarried, Steve hoped for some kind of family stability. Instead, he found more pain. His stepfather was abusive, a man who used fists instead of words. McQueen, small but defiant, often fought back, but the beatings left scars, both physical and emotional. In later interviews, McQueen admitted that those early years of neglect and abuse hardened him. They gave him the survival instinct that audiences would one day see in his films. He wasn't pretending to be tough on screen. He was drawing from a childhood where toughness was the only way to survive. But for young Steve, survival meant rebellion. And that rebellion soon led him into even darker territory, reform schools and institutions where the system tried to break him. By the time Steve McQueen was a teenager, he had learned one brutal lesson: nobody was coming to save him. His stepfather's fists were a constant reminder of the violence waiting at home, and his mother's instability meant there was no safe place to run. McQueen, small but fiery, didn't take the abuse quietly. He fought back, often squaring off against his stepfather in explosive confrontations that ended with Steve thrown out of the house. For a boy with no guidance and nowhere to belong, the streets became his only refuge. He started running with gangs, stealing bikes, picking fights, and testing boundaries wherever he could. Trouble followed him everywhere. Teachers couldn't control him. His family didn't want him. And soon, the law stepped in. By his early teens, McQueen was drifting through juvenile courts, a familiar face to local authorities who saw nothing but another delinquent destined for prison. Eventually, the system decided to send him to reform school, a place designed to break rebellious boys and force them into obedience. McQueen was sent to the Boys' Republic in Chino, California. It was strict, harsh, and unforgiving. The boys were forced to live under rigid discipline, with every mistake punished severely. At first, McQueen resisted. He lashed out, fought the rules, and earned punishments. But something began to change. For the first time in his life, McQueen encountered a place where toughness wasn't just about fists, it was about responsibility. The program demanded that boys work for their keep, that they support each other, and that they face consequences for their actions. Slowly, McQueen adapted. The structure gave him something his chaotic childhood never had: order. He began to see the value in discipline, in controlling his anger, in channeling his defiance into something productive. Later in life, McQueen would often credit Boys' Republic as a turning point. Even after becoming a millionaire movie star, he quietly donated to the school, returning to visit and support the troubled boys who reminded him of himself. But as much as reform school gave him discipline, it didn't erase the fire inside him. When McQueen left, he still carried the scars of abuse and abandonment. He was harder, more self-reliant, and still determined never to let anyone control him. That mix of toughness and defiance became his trademark. And when the next chapter of his life arrived, the United States Marine Corps, McQueen would carry those lessons with him into a world that demanded even more discipline and gave him a chance to prove himself once again. Boys Republic may have given Steve McQueen his first taste of order, but it didn't tame him completely. The fire that had burned in him since childhood, the instinct to rebel, to resist authority, was still there. What changed was that now he had tools to channel it. He learned responsibility, he learned the value of hard work, and he learned that toughness wasn't just about surviving the streets. It was about proving yourself. When he left Boys Republic, McQueen carried those lessons with him, but the world outside was just as chaotic as the one he'd left behind. He drifted through odd jobs, bounced between relatives, and lived on the margins of society. By the time he was 17, he had run out of options. That's when he made a decision that would change his life. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. For most young men, the Marines were a path to discipline and honor. For McQueen, they were another battlefield. His rebellious streak clashed with military authority almost immediately. He went AWOL more than once, got into fights with superior officers, and was even thrown into the brig for insubordination. At one point, he lost his rank multiple times, demoted again and again for refusing to fall in line. But the Marines also gave him something no reform school ever could: pride. Beneath the punishments and the push-ups, McQueen found a brotherhood and a sense of belonging he had never felt before. The very structure that once suffocated him began to sharpen him. His natural toughness made him stand out, and when he applied himself, he excelled. The defining moment came during an Arctic exercise when a military transport ship struck a sandbank and began to sink. Many of the Marines on board panicked. McQueen, instead of running, risked his own life to pull several men to safety. His bravery earned him commendation from his officers and the respect of his unit. For once, his defiance had transformed into leadership. By the time he left the Marines, McQueen wasn't a polished man, but he was a hardened one. He had discipline, he had confidence, and most importantly, he had survived a system designed to break him. But McQueen still didn't know where he belonged. He drifted back into civilian life, taking odd jobs as a mechanic, a lumberjack, even a carnival worker. And then, almost by accident, fate pushed him in a direction nobody expected, toward the stage. The boy who had once been written off as a delinquent was about to discover the one place where his rebellion, toughness, and silence would finally make him a star. When Steve McQueen left the Marines, he was tougher, sharper, and more disciplined than the boy who had once run wild in the streets. But he was also restless. Civilian life felt empty compared to the adrenaline of survival, and he drifted through odd jobs, never settling for long. He worked as a lumberjack, cleaned up in oil fields, and even joined the carnival, riding motorcycles in the Wall of Death stunt show. Each job carried danger, but none gave him purpose. Then came the turning point. Thanks to the GI Bill, which provided education benefits to veterans, McQueen found his way into acting classes. At first, it wasn't about passion. It was about opportunity. Acting seemed like an easy way to earn money and maybe impress women. But the moment McQueen stepped onto a stage, something clicked. Unlike other aspiring actors, McQueen didn't have formal training, a polished voice, or textbook technique. What he had was authenticity. He didn't need to pretend to be tough or rebellious or dangerous. He was all those things. Directors noticed immediately. He didn't overact or rely on flashy monologues. Instead, he used silence, stillness, and a stare that could fill the screen. In New York, he trained at the neighborhood playhouse under Sanford Meisner, one of the most respected acting coaches of the time. While classmates performed with flourishes, McQueen stood out by doing less. He listened, he smoldered. And in that simplicity, audiences saw truth. He started with small stage roles, scraping by on pennies. He slept on rooftops, ate canned beans, and fixed motorcycles to survive. But every performance added to his mystique. Casting agents began to take notice of the wiry ex-Marine with the piercing blue eyes and the chip on his shoulder. By the late 1950s, McQueen landed his breakthrough on television with Wanted, Dead or Alive, playing bounty hunter Josh Randall. The show gave him national exposure, but more importantly, it showed the world his trademark style, the quiet rebel, the man who spoke volumes without words. America hadn't seen an actor like him before. He wasn't polished like Cary Grant. He wasn't towering like John Wayne. He was something new, gritty, dangerous, and real. It was the beginning of a persona that would define a generation. And soon, McQueen would take that television fame and explode onto the big screen. Because the boy who once roamed the streets as an unwanted child was now on the verge of becoming the king of cool. By the early 1960s, Steve McQueen had already made his mark on television. But television couldn't contain him for long. He was too magnetic, too raw, too real. Hollywood came calling. And when McQueen hit the big screen, everything changed. His breakout moment came in 1963 with The Great Escape. Surrounded by some of the best actors of his generation, including James Garner and Richard Attenborough, McQueen stole the film with one unforgettable sequence, the motorcycle escape. It wasn't just a stunt, it was a statement. As McQueen's character revved that bike across the German countryside and launched himself toward freedom, audiences around the world leaned forward in their seats. For many, it was the first time they truly saw the raw, rebellious power of Steve McQueen. From that moment, he was more than a rising star. He was a cultural icon. But McQueen wasn't satisfied with being part of an ensemble. He wanted to carry films on his own terms, and in 1968, he got the perfect vehicle, literally. That year, he starred in Bullitt, a gritty police thriller set in San Francisco. McQueen's performance was classic him, restrained, controlled, and effortlessly cool. But it was the car chase that made history. 10 minutes of roaring engines, screeching tires, and narrow escapes through the steep streets of San Francisco. No background music, no flashy effects, just raw sound and real driving. And much of it was McQueen himself behind the wheel. The chase set a new standard for action filmmaking and cemented his image as the king of cool. By the end of the 1960s, McQueen was the highest-paid actor in Hollywood. He had done it on his own terms, picking his projects carefully, rejecting anything that didn't fit his image. His quiet intensity, his ability to say more with a glance than most actors could with a monologue, made him unique. In an era of polished leading men, McQueen was the outsider, and audiences loved him for it. Every studio wanted him. Every director wanted to capture his presence. But McQueen never forgot where he came from. He wasn't a polished movie star. He was still the kid from reform school, the Marine who fought authority, the rebel who refused to play by the rules. And that rebellious streak didn't just make him famous, it made him untouchable. But fame and fortune couldn't erase his past. Beneath the cool exterior, McQueen carried the scars of his childhood, scars that never fully healed. And as his career soared, his personal battles followed close behind. By the late 1970s, Steve McQueen was more than just an actor. He was a symbol. To audiences, he was the loner with the quiet stare, the rebel who stood apart from the crowd, the man who never seemed to answer to anyone but himself. But behind that cool exterior was a lifetime of scars. The boy who had once been abandoned, beaten, and written off as a lost cause had transformed himself into one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. He didn't just survive reform school, the Marines, and the streets. He turned that pain into fuel. Every glare, every silence, every burst of defiance on screen wasn't performance. It was lived experience. That's why audiences believed him. McQueen never pretended to be something he wasn't. He wasn't polished, he wasn't perfect, and he didn't care to be. He was authentic in a way that few stars ever were, and that authenticity became the heart of his legend. He showed the world that toughness didn't come from privilege or polish. It came from struggle. Even in his final years, as illness took its toll, McQueen never stopped living on his own terms. He raced, he fought, and he faced his fate with the same stubborn independence that had defined him since childhood. When he passed away in 1980 at just 50 years old, the world mourned the loss of a star. But what they really lost was a man who embodied the very idea of rebellion. Today, decades later, Steve McQueen remains the king of cool. His films still inspire, his style is still copied, and his presence still looms large over Hollywood. And perhaps the greatest part of his story isn't the motorcycle jumps, the car chases, or the record-breaking salaries. It's that a boy who started with nothing, abandoned, beaten, and thrown into reform school, refused to be defined by his past. He rewrote his own story, and in doing so, he became a legend. Steve McQueen's rise wasn't just a Hollywood tale. It was proof that no matter where you start, you can choose where you finish, from reform school to king of cool.